Hey there, it is Saturday, so it's movie night, and I am here to present another quarantine quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. My name is Paul, and I've just finished my 25th week of quarantine. So this week, I'm just gonna dive right into the recommendations, and I'm actually recommending two separate quarantine quadruple features this week. I'm just combining them into one video. I'm not going to make two separate videos because it's all along the same topic. So we have a long weekend. We've got Labor Day weekend, and if you are working, you probably have 3 days. So I think you should stay home and watch some great movies instead of going out to that pool party at a big gathering, because we're still in a pandemic, so do everything you can to be safe, and the safest way to do that is sit at home and watch some movies. So we're gonna do a quadruple feature on Saturday, and then we're gonna do one on Labor Day as well, and we're gonna be talking about the very similar topics for both of these quadruple features. We are gonna be looking at one of the most debated topics in the world of horror, the very controversial and divided world of horror remakes. Ooh, even talking about it just gets people on edge when you talk about these horror remakes. And we're going to be talking about essentially two generations of horror remakes. So for our first quadruple feature for tonight, we are going to be talking about 80s horror remakes of 50s horror and sci-fi films. So let's dive right into that. We got 4 movies, of course. So last week, we just got to officially our 100th quarantine quadruple feature recommendation. So I've officially recommended 100 movies to you. I wanted to kick off the next 100 with one of my favorite movies. I wanted to make it a really kick-ass movie. I wanted to start off strong, and we're going to watch one of my favorite movies of all time, one of the greatest horror films, one of the greatest monster movies, really just one of the most effective films ever made. John Carpenter's masterpiece, The Thing, starring Kurt Russell. The Thing is one of the greatest practical effects monster movies ever made. If you have somehow gone your entire life without seeing John Carpenter's version of The Thing, came out in 1982, stop everything you're doing, drop whatever you're holding, get your hands on a copy of The Thing, and go watch this movie. I also feel like The Thing is perfect to watch in quarantine because this movie really just encapsulates everything about where we're at right now. These people are alone. They don't trust anyone. They are frightened. They are tired of being cooped up, and they are fighting a giant, seemingly unstoppable evil. So I think this movie is kind of very timely for right now. Now, when The Thing came out, it actually was not resoundingly successful. John Carpenter has had a bad track record for theatrical success. His movies have gotten, panned by the critics and haven't made a lot of money, and then, 10, 15 years later, they're regarded as a classic. Now, thankfully, John Carpenter is still alive, and he is reaping the benefits of having such an impressive body of work, but he wasn't always such a celebrated auteur of film. He was kind of just, lumped in together with a bunch of other horror filmmakers, even though his films kind of stand apart from the rest of the crowd. So in 1982, when this film came out, it came out the same year as another hit sci-fi alien movie called E.T., and E.T. was the kind of extraterrestrial movie that audiences wanted to go see that year. They wanted to go see nice, happy aliens befriending a sweet family of kids that don't have a dad. But John Carpenter's was much darker, much more nihilistic, and really just a violent, visceral monster movie. So people didn't really want to go see that. It wasn't very successful. It didn't really get great reviews. Now everyone regards it as one of the greatest horror or science fiction films ever made. So the special effects in this film by Rob Bottin are some of the best practical effects that have ever been put on film. Really, this thing is a showcase for how good practical effects were when they were reaching their peak in the 80s. And something sort of revolutionary that they did, John Carpenter said practical effects monster movies were usually, hiding the monsters in the shadows a little bit. That way you could hide the strings, you could hide the seams on the suits. He said, fuck it, we're gonna put everything in bright light. We're gonna show every angle of these monsters, so make them real good. And they made them real good. In fact, even by today's standards, these special effects hold up as something to behold. They're really phenomenal. Carpenter's The Thing is, of course, a remake of The Thing from Another World. A pretty solid 50s sci-fi horror film. It's from a short story called Who Goes There. The monsters in these two movies could not be more different. They are worlds apart. The monster in Thing from Another World is just like a man who looks like he has some like vegetation kind of growing off him. He's like part vegetable. And the monster in this is just like all these amazing practical effects. Our first movie is going to be John Carpenter's masterpiece, The Thing. I'm just going to crack through all 4 of the movies, and then I'm going to talk about kind of horror remakes from the 80s in general. All right, movie number 2, David Cronenberg's The Fly. The Fly is truly one of the great horror films. Jeff Goldblum has had a really interesting career, and a lot of people love him for how like zany and quirky he is, but this movie proves that he's also like a really, really strong actor. He gives a really amazing performance as Brundle. If you ever heard someone reference the Brundle fly, it's from The Fly. Also, equally important in this film is Gina Davis, who really holds the film down emotionally with an incredible performance that I don't think gets the credit that it deserves, especially kind of in the world of horror performances. She has such a complicated role to play in this film, and she's kind of balancing a lot of emotions, and her character is dealing with so much in the film as well. So The Fly, again, a practical effects extravaganza, a masterpiece of body horror. David Cronenberg co-wrote the film and directed it. He is the master of body horror. It's really a kind of a horrific view on how our bodies will eventually break down. You can see it as a metaphor for, you know, death, aging, whatever you want. And there's a lot of people who have argued that it's an allegory for AIDS. Whether you think it is or not, it's certainly kind of about your body betraying you. The Fly is, of course, a remake of the Vincent Price vehicle, The Fly. And The Fly is quite a bit different in the original. It's like a guy. It's like a guy with a big fly head. And this one is much more of a full body sort of transformation. The original Fly it's a little cheesy, but it's still really solid. Now it deals with some heavy topics of like, what are you going to do when you start changing that drastically? But the original Fly is really good. But yeah. Cronenberg's is one of the best films of the 80s. Truly love David Cronenberg's The Fly. There's a moth flying around in here, so I better not teleport with that. Okay, next we are going with another childhood favorite. All 3 of these movies really affected me very strongly when I was a kid, with no exception. Chuck Russell's The Blob, with a script co-written by Frank Darabont of Shawshank Redemption and The Mist fame. This is a monster movie that really kicks ass and really scarred me as a kid. You know, you think, how can a blob be scary? And this blob is absolutely terrifying. The way that it consumes people in this, and again, the practical effects in this movie are some of the best of the decade. There's a very horrific scene where a guy is in a car trying to take advantage of a drunk girl, and he starts unbuttoning her shirt, and some blob shit happens, and it scarred me for life. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna hook up with a girl. That was terrifying. The Blob is, of course, a remake of The Blob from the 50s, starring Steve McQueen. Now, of the 4 original films from the 50s, I think The Blob is probably the weakest. The visual effects are quite silly. It's not particularly scary. And it's such a silly, just very 50s concept that translates unbelievably well to the 80s and makes it a really scary upgrade. That's going to be movie number 3, Chuck Russell's The Blob. And then we're going to our 4th movie. This one's a bit of a cheat. I said each of the movies was a remake of a film from the 50s. This is an 80s horror remake of a film from the 40s. Paul Schrader's Cat People. Now, I could have gone with Invaders from Mars by Tobe Hooper. Is another 80s remake of a 50s horror film. The original Invaders from Mars just is not a very strong film. It's very corny. It's also in color. It was kind of in the early days of color, so it doesn't really look that great. Honestly, they probably should have filmed it in black and white. It just looks a little weird. It's not visually as pleasing as some of the earlier black and white films. The reason that I went for Cat People instead is because I wanted to get a little feminine energy into this quadruple feature, and this is the only one of these movies that has a female protagonist that's kind of going through crazy body horror type changes. Cat People is a super sexual movie about a woman that is sort of trying to embrace the changes that are happening within her as she gets closer and closer to becoming physical with men. And she knows once she becomes sexually active, she turns into like this werewolf type creature, but it's a cat. It was a remake of Cat People. This is a 2-disc, but this Cat People is a film by Jacques Turner, and the original Cat People is really a brilliant film. In fact, this is one that should be taught in every film class as a prime example of how to use lights and shadows and sound effects as a substitute for actually having a budget for special effects. So the original Cat People shows very little. In fact, out of the 4 movies that we're watching, the original Cat People is probably the best of the originals. Cat People, a Paul Schrader film remake of Jacques Turner's Cat People. That's going to be the 4th one that we watch. So when we talk about horror remakes, people are very divided on them. However, there seems to be a general consensus that these 80s remakes are accepted. People really like the 80s horror remakes, and I think there's a few reasons that these movies are kind of commonly viewed as great 80s horror films, and people don't even really view them as remakes very often anymore. They've kind of taken on a complete life of their own. They stand separate from all of the movies that they're remade from in the 50s. And I think the reason that 80s remakes get so much love when modern remakes are met with a lot more trepidation is for a couple different reasons. Part of it being filmmaking and where the film industry is at and the changes that have happened. And part of it is, I think, where we're at societally. Okay, so let's take a look at these movies from the 80s. They were remade from films in the 50s for the most part. So about a 30-year gap between those films. That seems like a pretty good amount of time to let pass before you try to remake a film. And all the films we're going to talk about for our second quadruple feature, they're roughly 30-year gap as well, but they were met with a completely different response as some of these remakes. One of the reasons I think these movies stand apart on their own is that filmmaking changed so drastically by the time we get to the 80s. So you look at the movies from the 50s, and what's the biggest change that's happened since then? We've gone from black and white to color. So already we're updating these films for a modern audience that has already turned their backs on black and white films, right? So when you're updating films today from a movie in the 70s, nothing has really changed that much visually as far as filmmaking goes. So they don't really need to be updated for a modern audience the way that 80s films are accepted as being updated for a modern audience. So they go from black and white to color. There's another sort of tectonic shift in the industry as well, and that's the world of practical effects. The world of special effects has been blown wide open by the time we're in the 80s, and we're showing audiences things they never could have seen before in the 40s and 50s. And the other thing is the Hays Code has been lifted, so there's no restrictions on what you can show in these monster movies. So they are all out gore fests. They are having people getting ripped apart. They're having people transforming into horrible creatures. They're having aliens biting people's arms off. You're showing things that you would not have been able to imagine 30 years prior. So really, the difference between the films from the 50s and 80s is like they are worlds apart from each other. And that has helped the 80s remakes really stand out on their own. Even the style of performance was very different. It was very kind of stilted and strange in the 40s and 50s. And the writing for some of these sort of sci-fi type horror films was generally very cheesy in the 50s because, you know, sci-fi wasn't as universally as accepted as kind of a genre as it is now. So they assumed audiences were stupid about certain things. So it's like, well, Mary, when the UFO, unidentified flying object, was flying at a velocity that, you know, it's like the way they stop and explain things to like the silly woman in the movie. It's very patronizing. It's very cringeworthy to watch that now, and the performances are, they're very artificial, and all of that artifice was kind of stripped away by the time you get to some of the films in the 80s. So the world of film was a completely different place when the movies first came out, and where society was very different as well. So in the 50s, the big thing that audiences are really afraid of is like the Cold War, okay? That's going on. And granted, that was still going on in the 80s, but no one was really afraid of like nuclear war at that point, okay? They weren't doing duck and cover drills in schools anymore at that point. But in the 50s, when the Cold War was kind of at the height of its threat, everyone was afraid of that. Everyone was paranoid, not trusting their neighbors. They're afraid Russians were infiltrating the United States. And so the films kind of reflected Cold War fears. So it was like, watch the skies, don't trust your neighbors. The world was in a totally different place in the 80s. America was in a slap a big shit-eating grin on your face and pretend like everything's okay type of place. That's when we were in Ronald Reagan's America. So Reaganomics was something that was in the process of drastically changing the world, right? Which has ultimately led to where we are now. Reagan's America was the beginning of the dissolve of the middle class, so that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, and people like me and probably you today can't afford to buy a house, or we work our fucking asses off when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, and still we're barely maintaining our lives, and we're spending most of our money on rent. If you live in Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco, you don't really have enough to save. That all started because of Reaganomics, and there was a lot of filmmakers who were making movies that were a response to that, a response to like the war on drugs that was going on and the cleaning up of America, the big push for decency. 80s horror films were just a knee-jerk reaction to all of that. So they were dark, they were nihilistic, they were pessimistic, and very different than the 50s movies, which always ended with the good guys winning and hope being something that we can all look forward to. The 80s horror films were very hopeless, and audiences were scared of different things at that point. So that's kind of my little mini thesis on 80s horror remakes and why they have remained so effective and why they're very even rarely viewed in accordance with the original films that they were based off of. So now we're going to look at a different set of horror remakes. We are going to look at horror remakes from the 2000s, remakes of films from the 70s and very early 80s. So these films, again, are about 30 years apart from the original to the remake. All of these films were met with very different reactions from the horror community because the movies that were being remade were staples of horror at that point. Horror was really widely accepted by the 2000s, and everyone loved these horror films that were getting remade. So let's take a look at the four we are going to be watching on our Labor Day quadruple feature, and then I'll kind of dive into why I think it's a different mindset with horror films now. The four remakes that I've chosen for our second quadruple feature, I wanted all of them to be really brutal and effective films. So these four that I've chosen, I actually think are all really good, even though the source material is really great as well. I think all of these movies are really exceptional. And one of my favorite horror remakes, believe it or not, The Hills Have Eyes. This is by Alexander Aja, and I think it's just like a grisly, brutal masterpiece. So The Hills Have Eyes is, of course, a remake of Wes Craven's film, The Hills Have Eyes, and it doesn't stray too far from what goes on in this movie. It does kind of tack on an extra act, almost, which I think does the movie good. The mutant practical effects are really great. Alexander Aja's The Hills Have Eyes is going to be the first remake that we're watching out of our 2000s, our crop of movies from 2000 to about 2015 or so. All right, remake number 2 that I think is a really brilliant movie. Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead, which is, of course, a remake of Sam Raimi's masterpiece, The Evil Dead. I think both of these movies are really wonderful, but this one, Sam Raimi's is pretty scary. I mean, I saw it when I was a kid, and it really scared the shit out of me. But when you watch it today, it's a little campy, and it's a lot of fun. There's no camp in the remake of Evil Dead. This one is just like pure terror, and to their credit, almost all the visual effects in the movie are practical effects. So everything you're seeing on screen, they actually accomplished in camera, which is a feat in itself for modern films. I think this one came out in 2013, but I think it's actually really, really great horror remake. Movie number 3. This one blew me away. I was not expecting this to be as good. I was going in very trepidatious for Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, but Dawn of the Dead is a blast. It has all the trappings of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. You know, it's a group of people in a mall. This is essentially 4 people in a mall for a very long film. This is a huge group of people in like a brisk 90-minute film, and it is action-packed. The zombies are great, the action's great. In the first 10 minutes of this film, it's like one of the best openings in cinematic history. I know that's such a bold claim for like a 2000s remake of a classic horror film. The first 10 minutes are phenomenal. The opening of the film, it's unbelievably good. And then for our 4th film, for Quadruple Feature number 2, I actually really debated between a few films, but ultimately decided on Maniac, made by Frank Calhoun. But this one is just a relentless, really gritty, grimy remake of a really grimy New York thriller, Maniac, by William Lustig. Now, this Maniac is, they transport the action to Los Angeles, and it stars Elijah Wood. So it's cool to see a big star in a role like this that gets as kind of dark and depraved as this one does. So the remakes that we are going to be watching for our second quadruple feature on Monday, The Hills Have Eyes, Evil Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Maniac. And all of the original films I have, they're all for some reason these giant box sets. They're massive box sets I have for these. But yeah, all the original films are great, and we're going to be watching some of them on various other nights that we have. Now, some of the other remakes from the era that I think are really solid as well, The Crazies, of course, a remake from George Romero's film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, remake from a really gritty, not as popular 70s kind of slashery movie. The Last House on the Left, I actually think is like a really solid remake of Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. I think part of the reason I like it so much is that I'm not particularly attached to Wes Craven's original film as much as I like the rest of his filmography. Last House on the Left just kind of grosses me out. And, you know, believe it or not, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the one that pretty much kicked off all the remakes, especially from like Platinum Dunes. And this was like the trendsetter for, you know, the remake of like Amityville Horror and House of Wax and 13 Ghosts and kind of all these, you know, subpar remakes. As much as I love the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of my top 5 favorite movies, I actually think the remake is just fine. I enjoy it quite a bit. I think it looks slick. What they did with a lot of these remakes is they would just get like a very popular music video director at the time, give them a really big horror property, and then fans would get blown out of proportion, angry about it, and super pissed off that they were, you know, thinking about touching such an important artifact as Dawn of the Dead or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or whatever. So I don't think just a remake is inherently bad. I think sometimes they can be really great, and I think these 4 modern remakes are an example of ones that have been done really, really well. So why are audiences so apprehensive about remakes today? Obviously, you're taking source material that is much more beloved than some of the 50s horror films. Audiences might have liked them. Audiences were not as passionately devoted to them as horror films from the 70s. Because at this point in the 2000s, obviously, we've had the advent of videotapes, VHSs, video stores, and people were able to get these movies and watch them over and over and over again. In the 50s, you would go to the movie and you would see that movie, and that was like when you saw the movie. You didn't have access to it in the same way to make you such a devoted fan that was obsessed with one of those movies. So the idea of remaking one of those movies 30 years later, it was not really that big of a deal. And I think the reason that so many of them don't stand up to the originals or won't stand the test of time is for a few of the reasons that we discussed for why the 80s movies work so well, is why some of these modern remakes don't work as well. So let's take a look at the filmmaking and then kind of where we are societally, okay? So you look at the filmmaking, there has not been as tectonic of a shift in the industry as there was between the 50s and the 80s when you went from black and white to color. So what have been the biggest changes in the film industry in the history of film? When we went from silent films to sound, that was a huge game-changing thing. And then the next big one was when we went from black and white to color. That was the next really seismic shift that happened in the industry. We haven't had something as massive since then. The only things you could really argue that would be big shifts in the industry since then have been going from practical effects to relying on computer-generated imagery for the visual effects. That's a big change that you've kind of seen over the past few decades. Now we rely almost solely on computer-generated imagery instead of practical effects. Speaking of visual effects, you look at the reason the thing is so effective. One of the reasons is the practical effects, but then you look at the remake, which came, about 30 years later, which they just called The Thing, and this one is all computer-generated imagery, and everyone hated the movie. It wasn't nearly as effective. And to their credit, they did try to create things practically. They did a bunch of practical effects on set, but then they just didn't work, and then they just wound up having to put CGI over it. You watch it, and it's a big CGI show, and our brains recognize that it's not really there, versus when you watch John Carpenter's masterpiece, it's like it's really there. The other big change is going from shooting on film to shooting on digital. But I don't think either of those things are going to be something you're going to argue is as massive of a change in the industry as going from silent to sound or black and white to color. Okay, you show the average film viewer a movie that's shot on film and then one that's shot on digital, and they don't really know that there's a difference when you watch those two DVDs next to each other. Of course, we can all tell the difference between practical effects and computer-generated imagery, and no one's really going to argue that that's like a really positive change that the industry has made. But filmmaking has not leapt as far ahead since the 70s as, it was, jumping from like the 20s to the 30s to the 40s to the 50s to the 60s. That's when all of the really massive changes were happening. So trends change, styles change, but the actual filmmaking isn't really changing that much. So it's not really modernizing them that much. And the other reason I don't think that they are hitting as hard is because society isn't that different than we were in the 70s. Of course, there have been tons of changes, but what are the main things? So you look at some of these films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes or a lot of these 70s horror films. The films are a direct response to Vietnam. Okay, and whether the films are directly commenting on Vietnam, which many of them aren't, and some of the filmmakers, have come out and said, like, my movie's not about Vietnam, people were seeing these movies as commentary on Vietnam. So once a filmmaker makes a movie and puts it out into the world can take it and interpret it however it wants. And all of these movies that were like hyper violent and they were scary and they were made with almost a documentary style of filmmaking, it was reflecting the carnage that people were seeing on the news from the footage that was coming back from Vietnam. Right? So that's how a lot of people were kind of coping with it in their everyday lives, were these horror movies, right? That's how they were kind of getting the catharsis of the horror that was going on in the world. And that was really the biggest thing in the 70s that people were really kind of coping with artistically was the conflict in Vietnam. You flash forward like 30 years in the 2000s, how are the majority of audiences that are going to see horror films in that time different than audiences in the 70s? They're in a war, they are disenchanted by their government, they're protesting things, they're frustrated as well. So like society was in a very similar place, and these films weren't necessarily a response to the kind of modern wars that were going on, but they were remakes of films that were responses to the Vietnam War. They weren't artists creating new art responding to something that was going on. They were just kind of retreading something else that was going on. And society hadn't changed very much. It was like everyone was still dealing with our country at war. So arguably society hadn't really been changing like that much. Not as seismic of a shift as, what Americans were really afraid of in the 50s versus what they're afraid of in the 80s. What we're afraid of in the 70s is very similar to what we're afraid of in the 2000s. So that's why I think the modern remakes aren't holding up as well as the 80s remakes. Modern remakes have so much resistance is the necessity for them, where we are as a society kind of needing this type of art still. It's like we need kind of new types of horror films, and we have a plethora of new types of horror films that are helping us kind of cope with the world, but retreading something from the 70s or 80s, that's not going to be kind of arguably as effective for society. But those are the two quadruple features. So quadruple feature number one, John Carpenter's masterpiece, The Thing, David Cronenberg's masterpiece, The Fly, Chuck Russell's The Blob, and Paul Schrader's Cat People. That is our quadruple feature for Saturday. And then our quadruple feature for Labor Day, Alexander Aja's The Hills Have Eyes, Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead, Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, and Frank Calhoun's Maniac are four gritty remakes of 70s and early 80s horror films. So those are the two quadruple features I have. Those are my thoughts on horror remakes, why some are viewed much more favorably than others, but you know, I've picked out 8 that in general I really like and I think are very solid. I hope you guys aren't partying too hard this Labor Day weekend. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. I hope you're staying safe and healthy. Thanks for watching. See you next week.